Hi, it's Colleen and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you a new project that I made, and it's this 18th century bedgown. There are a lot of bedgowns out online, but I did not see any videos on this particular pattern, which comes from Garsault. I'll show a diagram of it up here on the screen. It's a pattern diagram that was actually published in the 1760s. So that's contemporary with the same era where people would have been wearing these. And I like the idea of making something from an original pattern diagram that someone like me could have seen and used for their own clothing at that time. There are commercial patterns available online for bedgowns, but they're a little more simplistic than this particular pattern. And that's because there are two design features that are often left off on commercial bedgown patterns. One is this box pleat at the back of the jacket. From the neckline on down, you sew in a box pleat and it creates this little bit of fullness here at the bottom. I really like that. I also like this side pleating right here. And again, a lot of bedgowns don't include this. They actually have it taper from the underarm out to the hem so that it's full, but it's not pleated. I actually really like the pleating, and I like it being a little closer fitting up and through here. The thing about this pattern diagram is that it's not particularly clear. It includes minimal instructions, and it seems to be missing a pattern piece, which is an insertion into the collar. There are people out there who have tested and interpreted this pattern diagram to varying degrees of success. I think the reason why people tend to stumble on this pattern, particularly up in the collar, is that there are no written instructions for how to do this. And while you're putting it together, it does not seem like adding in a rectangle of fabric here will make this collar turn as nicely as it turns. When people have tried to recreate this pattern online, they end up with a lot of weird puckering right up where this neck slit gets cut in. I ended up following a set of instructions at this website right here. She has translated the instructions into English and interpreted them based on her own practical experiments with this. And if you follow the directions carefully, you'll see it lays really, really nicely. There's no puckering, there's no problems. It's just a really good fit. It's really tempting to think something so simple could just be made from the diagram and the measurements without doing a mock-up. I will tell you though that I am very, very glad I did a mock-up because I ruined it trying to figure out how to do the collar. But also I had a little bit of sizing issues that I wanted to fix on the final, and I'm much happier with the result because of that. So come along with me. I'll show you how I made this, and then I'll show you what it looks like on. When I work on a project that doesn't have a printed pattern, but instead uses your body measurements to create the pattern, I do like to do a small scale mock-up because it helps me understand how the project goes together. I think sometimes it's easier to visualize it in 3 dimensions than it is to visualize it as a flat piece of paper. So I went ahead and did that here, and I did it once before on my caftan video, and people seem to really like it, so I thought I'd show you the process here. This is what the bedgown looks like when it's constructed, and it is a quarter scale version of my measurements. I know that I made a mistake up here at the collar, so I'm going to try it again, and I figured since I was creating a new mock-up, I would show you the process along the way. You need a few measurements before you get started. The first is you need to know your bust measurement, and the instructions are to add about 11 inches of ease. All of the instructions at that website are in centimeters, and I work in inches because I'm American and we haven't adopted the metric system yet. Something that my engineer husband is very upset about. My bust measurement is 42 inches. Plus 11 inches of ease equals 53 inches. From now on, that will be called the body width because that is the main section of the body of that garment. You also need to know your arm measurement. So measure your arm around the bicep at its fullest point. So I kind of did mine a little bit flexed for my non-existent muscles. That's 12.5 inches for me, and you need to add about 2 inches of ease. So that's my second number, 14.5 inches. I need to know the measurement from my armpit to my waist. For me, that's about 8 inches. And then I need to know how long I want the finished product to be. I would like my bedgown to be about 30 inches from the shoulder to the hem. Multiply that by 2, and that is your total length of fabric. Don't forget to add a hem allowance, at least an inch or 2 on either side of that length of fabric in order to have a nice hem. So I'm complicating things a bit because I'm making a quarter scale version. So all of my measurements get divided by 4. So you'll see I have quite a few markings on here. The first thing I marked was my shoulder line. That's this folded in half. So from this point to the hem, that's your finished length of your garment. And this fold here becomes your shoulder line. Then I marked center front, right down the center from the shoulder line to the hem. And this is what I'm going to work with for the rest of my patterning. So first I started off by marking my body width, which is the bust measurement plus 11 inches of ease divided by 4, because you're only working with 1/4 of the bust measurement. And I marked a few spots along the way. Then I needed to measure my sleeve width. From here to here is only half of the sleeve width. And so then I marked a line from there to the end of the fabric. And then I marked a line from here down to my waist. So that was the armpit to waist measurement. Now, no matter where your body width is, you need to add about 8 inches from the waist directly out at a right angle to become the hip, right? So that's from the waist to the edge of your hip flare that you're going to make. And so from that point, draw a perpendicular line down to the hem, and that becomes your side seam. Cut all 4 layers, and if your fabric is really thick, you may want to do 2 layers and then repeat it on the other side. This fabric is what you're going to use for your gussets and your neck piece. So set that aside for now. Now we're going to open it back up, and we are going to cut along this center front line all the way to the shoulder. And this will be our front opening. You need to open the entire piece back up, and now you're going to cut a little bit further into the back, about 3.15 inches to here, and then you need to cut 4 inches on either side of this line perpendicular. So you got to trust the process here. You're cutting those lines into that fabric because this is where your collar is going to go. So now we've got these little flaps here, right? This is going to become sort of like your lapel, and it comes up and around. Before I cut anything else, I'm going to go ahead and do my back pleat from the neckline, which I've now cut, right? This is your neckline, down to the waist. So you make sure you mark this point across the waist. And we're going to take up a 2.75 inch back pleat from here to here. So I'm going to fold right sides together, and I'm going to sew up an inverted box pleat right all the way down here, 2.75 inches from the fold. There is that pleat, and you would iron it flat into like a box pleat right across the back. And that leaves you with a nice bit of a pleating and fullness below the waist right here. So once we get to this point, you need to probably cut this open just a little bit wider to make sure it's wide enough to accommodate you. I'm going to snip in just a little bit on either side and then follow that perpendicular line down back to the shoulder line. This is the part that trips a lot of people up on this, and it's where I think I went wrong on the last mock-up that I made. So now you have some tabs sticking up right here, and you're supposed to create a rectangular piece of fabric to connect these tabs to the back neck opening. This is the part I'm going to have to experiment with on the actual full-scale piece that I'm doing, because I don't really understand how this part works. We're going to ignore the neck for now. This is going to be a hot mess on the video, I'm sorry. I'm once again going to skip the gusset on this little tiny mock-up, but basically you close the sleeve from the cuff to the armpit with the gusset in there, and then down to the waist. Leaving this edge open, you then stitch from here to here. Now you can see I have stitched my sleeve shut, and I am ready to start pleating up this part right here. So right now it's got a gap right in there. Pretty much you just need to figure out what kind of pleating you want to have. It's really about whether it's pleasing to your eye. That is what you end up with, and you would just stitch across the top right here. I would do that for both sides, and then I can try it on and see if I need to make any additional adjustments. All you would do from there would be to hem the edges. If you choose to line it, which I will because my fabric is not two-sided, you can either line the whole thing or you can just create a facing And then when you turn back the collar and cuffs, that little bit of facing will show as a nice detail on the edge. Anyway, it's hard to explain, but this has helped me a lot to understand what I'm looking at in terms of proportions and pieces and, you know, how these collar pieces behave, because I just couldn't visualize it on my own. Here are the materials I've chosen for this project. I was hoping to make this bedgown out of wool, and my wool is not big enough without having to do a lot of piecing. I don't want to piece it because I think that kind of takes away from the simplicity of a bedgown. So what I'm going to do is use this curtain, which I did get from a thrift shop, and I can see why someone donated it. They washed it, and when they did, it shrank unevenly. The hems meet up here, but by the time you get over to this side, it's shorter on one side than on the other. There's nothing else wrong with it. It's a Pier 1 Imports panel, and it is a cotton and linen blend, and it's perfect for something like this project. I am going to do a facing out of this fabric because it's a nice match, and this will be my facing for my cuffs and around my neck. So this is what my final fabric is going to be, but I only have one shot at this. As you saw from all of the cutting, if I do something wrong, I'm going to mess it up. So I'm going to make a mock-up. This is a really nice cream and navy blue print. I'm going to go ahead and use this as my mock-up. Here you can see me transfer the measurements that we made earlier, and I'm doing it just like I did for the quarter scale mock-up, except obviously this time we're working at full scale. I've also sewn in the back pleat in preparation for making a collar. Measure this line right here and then cut a piece of fabric that is this long and as wide as these little stubs. And it kind of makes sense now that I'm holding it like this, that you're going to end up stitching along those three lines, and that will make the collar that will kind of turn over. I'm concerned it won't have enough oomph to go around the back. I need to have a finished length of 6.5 inches by 5.25 inches. And I need to add double the seam allowance to the short ends of the rectangle to each side, which means I need to have 8.5 inches by 5.25 inches. We'll see if that works. This is not making me very happy. It's really hard to get this sewn in here neatly. This puckers because you're fitting something in where there's not a seam allowance built in. Remember, you just cut into that. So you've got to fit this in somehow. You can see this pucker. So this is the top of the sleeve. This is the top of the shoulder. And there is a pucker there, no matter what. This is more puzzling than it should be. And I'm wondering what I'm doing wrong. I don't know, this may be a failed attempt, but that's why I didn't want to use my one and only fabric. I could buy a pattern for this, but I figure if the tailors of old could figure out how to make a bedgown from those instructions, I should be able to figure it out, especially with the help of somebody who's gone before me, but this is a mess. I definitely feel silly. I had forgotten to cut the angle for the tabs, right? So there's a right angle that's supposed to go from the back of the neckline back down to the shoulder line. And I forgot to cut that in. So all of the fussing I've been doing has been on the wrong shape around the neckline, which is no wonder why it didn't work. Once I fix that, you can see I've inserted the collar piece and it works just fine. This ends up becoming almost like a dart, the slit. So you have to sew it with a scant seam allowance there, and then you can gradually increase. I only did about 1/8 of an inch along through here and then decrease back to nothing along there, but it works. So there you go. I am going to go ahead and finish this mock-up. You can see I've really ruined it. I mean, I tore it and patched it with some interfacing and had to sew it finally because it kept tearing, and I just was going down the wrong track. A lot of these historical reproduction things are making assumptions that you know already how to do certain things. So when you look at the original from the 1760s, right, the original instructions, it basically says things like sew it up in the usual way, insert the sleeve like you would for a shift. It left out the collar piece entirely and just said insert a collar piece. We're left all these years later to guess, and we are not people who make our own clothes all the time. So You know, you do have to do a lot of guesswork. It's kind of the fun of it. It's sort of the archaeological dig, I guess, to figure out how did these pieces go together. But that was a very frustrating exercise. I mean, part of it is I missed a step, but part of it is it wasn't intuitive. Just because it's not intuitive doesn't mean it's not right. And really, I should have just trusted the instructions and done them the way that they said, and it would have worked out just fine, and I could have been well past this point by now. So I've been at this now, let me look at my, oh gosh, it's 7:15. So I've been at this for about 3 hours, and this is as far as I have gotten. I will close up the sleeves and the side seams and try it on with my stays. I think I'm gonna have to size up. I could be pleasantly surprised. Okay, here's the try-on with only half of the pleats pinned in. I just have on my undergarments. I don't have on my petticoats. I tried it on with the bum pad, and that did a lot of really weird stuff to the bottom here. I'm thinking because this was meant for working women and like undress, that people probably wouldn't have had a bum pad on. So I went ahead and took it off. Here are my observations. The collar is fine. I inserted gussets under the arms, and they're too big. I was looking at the reference website, and they mentioned centimeters up to 15 centimeters, which is close to 6 inches. So I just did a 6-inch square, and it's clearly too big. It creates a lot of bunching under there. So I'm gonna size down the gusset. The other thing I'm having trouble with is that this top part here is above my waist. So I need to move that down about 1.5 inches. I measured, I think, my high armpit instead of where the sleeve ends and the body starts on this. So I measured 8 inches, but I think I measured up too high. So I'm gonna move that down. And I do think I'm going to increase the body width. You can see here I've got nice fit across the back, but not quite enough volume in this pleat back here to really lay nice over my clothes. It fits nicely, but I think this is supposed to be a loose fitting garment, and I think going up a few inches in the body width will be good. And then that'll allow this pleat to be just a little bit deeper. I love the side pleating business right here. I like that detail a lot. That's really one of the reasons why I wanted to make this version instead of a regular bedgown pattern that didn't have any shaping here. I really like the pleating and the fullness it gives at the bottom. I may even make this part bigger than the 8 inches that it called for on that diagram. I wouldn't mind having just a little more fabric to play with. I will make longer sleeves because these are too short. Under normal circumstances, you would just piece in another section of sleeve. Overall, my changes include lowering the waist about 1.5 inches, increasing the size here just a little bit, but putting all of those extra measurements in this back pleat. So if I increase by 1.5 inches, 2 inches, I'm going to increase the back pleat a little bit as well. I'm going to decrease the size of the sleeve gussets and put a little extra fabric in here. But this is not bad. It's meant to be a loose, easy fitting garment. I don't want it too tight, but I also don't want it super baggy. Here are my revised measurements, and here is the bedgown cutout. I think this project is doomed, and I'll show you why. I was very confident in my measurements, and I used my big giant ruler and measured 14 inches in from the fold. Well, I didn't realize until I had already started cutting that this actually was on the wrong end of the ruler. So what I thought was 14 inches was actually 10 inches. So once I brought it out and added a seam allowance, then this measurement now is too short, and you can see I cut it here, and I should have left it alone. Where I was going to add more into those side pleats, now I actually have less fabric. I did increase the body size. This is going to be about 3 inches bigger all the way around once I sew all the seams. And that means that this is obviously going to be 3 inches bigger, which it may not require then as much fullness in the hips to fit, but this just makes me sick. So I'm going to go ahead and I guess just cut this the rest of the way off, and if I need to or decide to piece something into the middle of that pleat, I have this fabric to do that with. In addition to this problem, this is what came out of this section here, and it's not enough to lengthen the sleeves as much or in the way that I wanted to. I was hoping to make this sort of an angled piece to have a little visual interest, so to become a little fuller from the elbow down, and I cannot do that because there's not enough fabric here. So it's going to be a straight sleeve. I do have this extra fabric that I cut off from the length of it, so there's plenty to make the gussets. I just don't even know. You guys, I'm tired of this project. I was really excited to do it, and now I'm just tired of it. That didn't go as planned. And this certainly wasn't what I planned. I'm going to go ahead and start making it up the way I did the last time, and I will let you tune in on any areas that seem to be of interest. I have decided to call this the Bedcoat of Doom. If it can go wrong, it's going wrong. But here's how I fixed where the pleats are going to be on the side. I went ahead and just stitched it on with a very, very narrow seam allowance. I pressed it open and then put some of this fusible interfacing on top of it. And I think it's going to be fine. This will all get hidden in the pleats. So that crisis has been averted. But yeah, this just been, it's been what should have been an easy project has now taken me way too long to solve this kind of problem. I wasn't going to come back and talk to you until I was further along, but I decided I needed to show you the rest of this collar. As we stated before, you're going to insert this pleat at the back of the neck. Then you need to make sure that this distance from here to here is wide enough for your neck. So you initially cut it in, it's like 4 inches on either side, but you're taking up a lot of it into this box pleat. So then that becomes very narrow, and you will need to widen it for your own neck. For me, this measurement now is 7 inches from here to here. And then I cut a right angle from there back to the shoulder line. And that leaves me with this sort of tab. Again, with the Bedgown of Doom, I had to piece the collar, but that's okay because it's going to be turned back like that anyway. It won't matter that there's a seam running down the middle of it, but I did have to piece it. Here, the short ends of that collar piece have been attached to the tabs, and now I will line up this center with that back seam, and I will stitch along here. There is a right angle, so you'll have to, you know, pivot and clip into that corner a little bit once you get it sewn. But right here on the edge, you're going to sew it almost like a dart. I don't know what I was worried about, but that fits in there really nicely. And you can see because I sized up the bedgown, I have more of a collar to turn. And here's a close-up on that seam over the shoulder. You can see it lays nice and flat. I learned from the mock-up that it's a good idea to mark your seam lines on your gussets. So on the wrong side of the gusset and on the right side, just in the corner of the sleeve right here. There's a finished gusset, and here's the other one. I sewed up the side seams and I sewed up the hip areas with a 8-inch gap for being able to reach into my pocket. This may be hard to see on camera, but I have pleated this in overlapping pleats. So it's basically a double box pleat, but I'm overlapping the 2 inner pleats, and that makes kind of a nice bit of detail there on the side. But anyway, I've got them folded and pinned, and I'm going to stitch right along the top here. You can see that kind of sits away because you've given a seam allowance to the top of the hip area. So there's room here to stitch this piece together, and then at some point I will tack it down to the main body of the bedgown. To finish the sleeves and line the cuffs, I just made a copy of this extension piece that I had to put on here to get the correct length for the sleeve with my lining fabric. Insert the cuff lining into the sleeve, right sides together, and you can see I'm just going to stitch right around there, and then when I turn it, I'll have a nice finished edge here, and I can hand stitch down the remainder over on this side. I've stitched on this contrasting lining. It's like a facing along the front edge. The inside part of that facing has a 1/2 inch folded over and ironed. Here is the stitch to use. You come up through the fabric and go right back through, catch a thread right next to where you came up, and then you can travel underneath the fabric to your next stitch. This is a felling stitch, so we're going to go right back, pick up a thread or two, right opposite of where we came out of the red fabric, and then travel. When I say that this pattern is very efficient on fabric, this is what I mean. This is all that's left. And part of the reason that I even have this much left is because it was too long and I ended up cutting it off just a little bit. So had I started with a piece of fabric that was exactly the right length, of course, I wouldn't have needed to have even this much left. So that's the 18th century bedgown, and it is a surprisingly comfortable and modern looking garment. Some people even make these to wear as modern day clothing that gives a nod to a historical past. And I'll show a picture up here if I manage to do that. I'm going to try it on with a pair of jeans one day and just see how it looks. I am very, very happy with how it turned out. I definitely plan to make more of these in the future. They are quick and easy to make, and it doesn't really require a ton of fabric, but you also don't have a lot of fabric waste, which is great. This is the hat I made in my last video. So I'm finally showing you how that looks with an 18th century costume. I don't know that people would have necessarily worn a hat like this. They might have just only worn their cap when they wore a bedgown, but for kicks, I'm putting it on. It kind of matches my costume and I like it. Thank you for joining me for yet another video on historical clothing. Next up, I would like to try another bodice type using the burgundy wool that I showed in my last video. And I need to start thinking about what I'm going to wear to the ball. We're having an 18th century ball here in St. Louis in October of 2023. So I'm looking at maybe making a robe à la française, and that will require some additional underpinnings. And of course I need to mock it up and figure out my pattern before I dive into cutting it with my fancy fabric. So I'll document that whole process along the way, but I also have a lot of other ideas up my sleeve. So stay tuned if you want to see what's coming next. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. You can also stay up to date with my channel between videos by following me on Instagram. Thanks for watching and have a great day.